Hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing well.
Cool.
Are you
We're
listening to your following your dreams?
have I listened to myself following my dreams?
Are you listening to your heart and following your dreams?
Yes, always. That's why I'm so happy.
Great.
You too?
Sure. Why not? No, I've been totally fake, and I've been slaving away at a corporation I hate.
You don't even like history. You're just pretending.
No.
Let's get into it. Well, today we're talking about early America.
Yeah. Um, so this is we keep on covering time periods I collect weapons from. This is probably because I'm the guy who's picking both the swords and the time periods.
Yeah,
This is a 17th century English backsword.
amazing.
And so with this episode, we're going to look into the foundation of modern America. And I mean, America is the United States of America. The Spanish had their own empire. There were Portuguese colonies in Brazil. We all know that. Um, and basically, how the US as a country came to be, where Americans tend to act like our history starts in 1776 with the American Revolution. And you'll very rarely find Americans who study what the culture of America formed as before the Revolution. But something to keep in mind is America was a British colony for 200. Amer- Britain formed its first colonies, America, around 1600. America seceded in the 1770s, which is 180 years. So America spent 180 years as a British colony, and then it spent 250 years as independent. So America has spent nearly as much time as a British colony than as an independent country. And this is a time period we never really think about. And it's one of, I say this for all the topics because we're going through my favorites first. This period of colonial America is one of my favorite eras of history because through it you can understand how America works as a country.
Say more about that. How do we understand, or what further appreciation do we have as about America from understanding it?
I find that you can understand how a culture operates through seeing what its childhood was. And so, by understanding the terms through which a culture formed, you can see what its cultural operating system will be for much of the rest of its history. Where Russia, as an example, formed to fight against the Mongols. And so, all these assumptions you see in Russia today, whether the large government, the aggressive militarism, their stoic culture, all evolved to fight off the Mongol threat. And if you want to look at China, the cultural forms China has now were formed thousands of years ago under Confucius or Lao Tzu or the Han Empire. And so for America, the way American culture operates stems from choices and conditions which were formed during the colonial period.
So yeah, when we think about American history, we often think about from the Declaration of Independence on, but we don't really learn a ton more about the colonial period. So say
Yeah.
more about that colonial period that would help inform our understanding of what came after.
One of my favorite authors, Leland DeWitt Baldwin, said that America is a side effect of the English Civil War. And I think that's a really good way to view it because England in the 1600s had a lot of the same issues that America has right now. It was a very politically divided society. It was incredibly unequal. You had large amounts of poverty. You had political fanaticism, which was manifested through both politics and religion back then. And England was on the verge of a civil war. And I've said in multiple previous videos how I think the English Civil War is a decently good parallel for the Civil War that I predict America will have. And an ironic thing is that the ancestors, if you want to look at the English speaking world civil wars, it's the same group of people. The descendants of the two factions in the English Civil War were the two factions which fought in the American Civil War, and then they're the factions that are fighting in this one. So I guess that's a good place to get started, where England was a very divided society, and it was divided between the parliamentarians and the royalists. And the royalists were based out of southwestern England, and the parliamentarians were based out of eastern England. And the England was an autocracy with a monarch with the parliament. And so there was this jousting of power between, did the parliament deserve more power or did the monarch deserve more power? And this was resolved through a civil war. And this isn't an episode in the English Civil War, but what you guys should know is that a civil war broke out when the king didn't want to listen to the parliament. When the king wanted to raise taxes and parliament said no, he tried to shut down parliament. Parliament crushed the king. And then England became the parliamentaries' army launched a coup, which then turned England into a military dictatorship. And then when the military dictator died, they reinstalled the monarchy. You guys don't need to remember that, but over the course of this episode, what happened in England was that in each phase of political power, one faction that didn't like the other, that one faction inside England which didn't like the ruling government would flee to America. And so that's how America formed, in that you have these different groups leaving the British Isles to the eastern seaboard of America to escape political repression inside England.
And why did England let that happen?
That's a great question. So if you want to look at the other European empires of that era, England and the Netherlands were the only two ones which did that. In that, if you want to look at the Spanish or the French empires, they had very tight controls on immigration because they wanted their colonies to be pure and they didn't want to have these people breeding. And so if you were a religious heretic or a political dissenter, you couldn't move to the giant Spanish Empire. Same with the French. And what this turns out with is that it created these kind of these stultified, not very creative societies. And so if you look at Mexico or Quebec and Canada, like not much has happened there. And England was different because it had a parliament, so there wasn't as much of a centralized control. Power was distributed equally in England, so there wasn't a strong centralized government that could make decisions like that. And furthermore, the English just wanted to get rid of these people. They they called people who immigrated to America undesirables, and they thought once the undesirables they called them undesirables and non-productives. Once the non-productives left England, they didn't have to deal with them anymore. Put them on a different continent so they don't have to worry about them.
Yeah. And did they not have the concern that they would rebel or fight for their independence?
Not really. People in the past, they don't have the hindsight that we do. And so America rebelled 200 years after the British colonies had formed. And I don't think anyone should be responsible for hindsight of 200 years in the future. That's just I don't know what's going to be happening in the 23rd century. And the biggest reason the English formed their colonies in America is because of the Spanish, where Spain conquered the Aztecs and the Inca down in Mexico and Peru, and they became legendarily wealthy off that. And so the Spanish then used this tremendous amount of gold and silver that they got from Latin America to try to launch a series of wars. And so for 150 years, the Spanish tried to conquer Europe on repeat, and they failed because the rest of Europe allied against the Spanish. So the English were looking at at the Spanish Empire, and they thought, we want that. And so with the first English colony in America in 1607 in Jamestown, their ideal was to do Mexico again, where you go in, you enslave the natives, you mine gold. The problem, though, is there wasn't any gold to mine, and there weren't enough natives to enslave. And so they ended up with an issue where, the thing that we intended to do is not going to work. And this ended up becoming the best thing that ever happened to America, because Latin America developed these extractive institutions where the Spanish were all but taking from the land and not adding anything. But because there wasn't that much to take in America, they had to think, we actually have to produce something. And so America started doing manufacturing actual goods. It started doing agriculture. And for Virginia, they started doing tobacco agriculture. They could grow tobacco in the climate there, and that was something that Europe wanted. And the first couple years of Jamestown, the first British colony, it was completely dystopian. I think 2/3 of the population died because their goal was to just conquer the natives and then have them farm for them. But that didn't work because it just, the natives were better fighters than they expected, and there weren't enough of them. And so they had to farm themselves. But in the first colony in Jamestown, there was all these warriors. None of these people knew how to farm. And so there was mass famine, and John Smith, who I think a lot of you would know from Pocahontas, he was actually one of the greatest badasses of that era. If you want to know John Smith's biography, he was a mercenary, fought for the Turkish Empire, he fought for the Austrians, he escaped slavery. He just lived an absolutely incredible life, and you would never know that from Pocahontas. But John Smith forced all the English to work, and he made a policy, if you don't work, you don't eat. And so Jamestown was able to pull itself back together from survival. And we have a significant amount of evidence that there was a Spanish mole in Jamestown who was poisoning all the water supply. Because the Spanish didn't want the Spanish had been colonizing Latin America for a century. They didn't want the English colonies in the east coast of the US to work. But then after like 30 years of horror, the first British colony in America at Jamestown actually worked.
How did it work?
They started growing tobacco. And because they found there was a tobacco market back in Europe, and Virginia had the perfect climate for tobacco. And that leads up to the creation of the American South. And so you had a couple different migrations leave England in this time period. The first one, or the first big one, where the first colony in America was Virginia. But Virginia was pretty lightly populated, and the first big migration was the Puritans to New England, where the Puritans were a fanatical religious cult in the eastern part of England, where the way Puritan culture worked is you had to attend church for 6 hours a week, where there was a giant painted eye of God that would stare down at the congregation. In Puritan culture, if you argued with your wife too loudly, she had the legal right, or it was illegal to argue with your wife too loudly. It was illegal to not work on Christmas. It's this very hardcore, very strict, literally puritanical, I mean, they invented the word puritanical for a reason, religion. And the ruling class in England were Anglicans, and which is a different sect of Protestantism. So the Puritans were being discriminated against by the government. So they made the decision, let's flee to New England where we can have religious freedom. And so most people think America was founded with the Mayflower, with the first Thanksgiving. This is political propaganda by New Englanders, because the New Englanders wrote the history of America. So they made the foundation of New England the most seminal moment in American history. As I said before, it was really in Virginia. And the Puritans were almost all middle class. Those people who were farmers, carpenters. So they never had the issues that the Virginians did. And New English culture developed from there. And New England was populated entirely by these middle class Puritans from Eastern England. And New England evolved into this ethno-state in which religious laws were the only thing it ran the entire society. And New England would score the best in almost any human development statistic you'd see in that time period. New England was the most educated, wealthiest, technologically advanced, lowest crime, lowest poverty of any place on the planet. But New England was also, as I said before, this incredibly oppressive society. And a theme that we're going to tease out across this podcast is that these cultures which were established in the colonial period, they exist until the present, where if you look at New England today, it has a lot of those same cultural traits, where it's the Puritans were very intelligent. And so Harvard, Yale, all of America's top universities were Puritan seminaries. And so you see a lot of the same traits among the New Englanders of very intelligent, productive culture. But even though it's not religion anymore, New Englanders are still fanatical. It's still a very judgmental society.
Yeah, and flesh out the connection between the groups of peoples that left and then the
Yeah.
Civil War and what you think the Civil War of the future is going to be.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about this as this video goes on. But one of my favorite history books is Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher. I'm actually writing an article for Samo with Palladium about this right now. And you saw these migration of these four groups from the British Isles to America, and they created the culture of a lot of modern America. The Puritans are one that I discussed before, going from East Anglia and Eastern England to New England. A second one, and we're going to go through all of these, is the Cavaliers from Western England to Virginia in the South, creating the culture of the American South. The third one is from the English Midlands in Northern England to Pennsylvania. And that made that was Quakers, and that made the culture of the American Midwest. And the fourth one is Scots-Irish from Northern Ireland and the English-Scottish from Southern Scotland. They moved to Appalachia, and they made the culture of the American Upper South. And so these four groups, you can find them in genetics today, where 60% of Americans belong to one of the cultural groups that was formed during colonial America. You can see it with accents, you can see it with voting patterns, you can see it with every single thing you'd look for in America today shows these different regional cultures. And Americans, in my opinion, tend to whitewash our culture in that we pretend that we're more unified and similar than we really are. Because as we'll talk about later, the US is a federation of different local identities, not a single one. And so we've been constantly trying to get past our different local regional identities. And politically, in the time of the English Civil War, it was a division between the parliamentarians and the royalists. And with that, what occurred is that the royalists populated America's South, and the Puritans and the parliamentarians populated New England. Now, in the American Civil War, it's the descendants of both those people. It's the North versus the South. Now, today, it's the Northeast and the West Coast against the South and the middle of the country. So across all of English-speaking history, you've seen these two factions, and they're all descendants of the same people. They've all fought against each other. In my part of the country, the Midlands, we have been the deciding factor. So across all of American history, the South has been conservative and the Northeast has been progressive. And they've fought against each other on every single social issue. You will never find a political coalition in America in which South Carolina and Massachusetts are on the same side.
And what makes you think there will be another Civil War, unless you were meaning that as a metaphor?
No, you guys should watch my video. I made like 5 videos on this topic, so
yes,
I don't want to get into it now.
Yes.
But I look at a bunch of different metrics, and so one of the videos I released recently, I think we will have a civil war within the next year.
Well, that's a big prediction. Yeah. Certainly the election lends itself to an opportunity for it. So yeah, we'll link to that in the video.
You can see if I'm a charlatan. Like I keep things real like this, so you guys can falsify what I'm saying. So New England was settled by the Puritans before the English Civil War. The English Civil War happens, the Puritans win. Now the old royalists have to settle a different part of America. And so this is the second sons of South English nobility, where the old ruling class before the Civil War lost. And because the Puritans were oppressing the old ruling class, they thought, let's go to America to experience freedom. And so they built up the American South to be like the old nobility back in Europe. And the author from Albion Seed, he makes an interesting point where he said, the South came first and then slavery happened, where the thing that saved Jamestown, the first British colony, was tobacco. The problem, though, is that this European nobility, these were the second sons of nobility back in Europe, they wanted to recreate that in America, is that there wasn't enough people, so that they had to get slaves, because if you're a white English guy, you move from southern England to Virginia, your landlord says you should work for me forever and work on my land. You say no, I have enough land, I'm just going to do that myself. And in frontiers, you see this across the world. Frontiers push one of two trends, either slavery or freedom, because a frontier is when there's not enough people for the land. So it either pushes people to say, hey, if there's not enough people, you should let people be free and do what they want. Or it pushes the trend of, I'm going to make the few people who there are do what I want. And so in every frontier, you see these two trends. And Eastern Europe, something people don't think about is that Eastern Europe was being populated at the same time as America. And so in Russia, you saw the Cossacks, who were free, they were free bandits. And then you had serfdom. So in Russia, it's the same thing. In America, it was slavery and freedom. And so that's why you saw both slavery and freedom in America. And so they brought in African slaves. And in Virginia, it was mostly from Nigeria and Senegal. And so coastal Virginia became 2/3 black. And then the further you moved away from the coast, it became majority white. But this created the South's culture of, the South became what effectively is a racial caste system, where blacks weren't allowed to own property. All blacks in Virginia, or almost all ones, were slaves. They weren't allowed to obtain an education. And Virginia had this strong class structure where there was a small, very educated elite. And then there was a lot of poor whites, and then there were black slaves. And so it's in many ways the opposite of New England, in that New England was this religious fanatical theocracy, and Virginia was about maintaining nobility. And the best way I see this is that, imagine if America made a space colony now, and conservatives and progressives formed different space colonies. What would a conservative or progressive state colonies look like 400 years from now? Imagine if American right-wingers and left-wingers formed their own societies, and then they evolved in their own totally different direction in isolation. And that's New England and the American South.
Right. And what was sort of the, at what point did there start to be kind of national cohesion around, hey, we are a people? Yeah.
That's the American Revolution, where before the American Revolution, the different American colonies trusted each other, trusted Britain more than they trusted each other. Because imagine you're a random dude in Virginia. You know a lot more people back in England who are migrating to you. You have family back in England. You don't have family in the other American colonies. And so they trusted England more than the other colonies, because also England was further out and was more objective. The English didn't care as much. Well, the other colonies, they were struggling over the same interests. And due to the French and Indian War, which we'll get to later, there was this concept, we need to fight the French, we need to fight the natives. And this external threat created more of an idea of national unity. But with the American Revolution, and we'll make a future episode of the American Revolution at some point, the British were oppressing America, and the Americans could tell that if they didn't unify, that they'd get that things wouldn't be good. And so there's this effort to construct a new national identity from all these different sub-regions. And that was a difficult enterprise, where you'll hear, do you know the Don't Tread on Me flag?
Yeah.
That's a remnant of that time period, where if you look at it closely, it's a snake of the 13 different colonies. And so it's this idea, and you see this across everything, in a lot of stuff in American society, where e pluribus unum, the thing in our currency, is Latin for out of many one. Or the Don't Tread on Me, it's these 13 different colonies forming a single snake. And back in the day, the thing I would say is that we stand together or we hang together. And so there was this concept with the American Revolution that if we as Americans didn't work together against the British, that we would all be turned into a colony. And so there was this conscious effort to create a nation. But even in the early republic, before the U.S. Civil War, people called it these United States. It was a plural because it's a United States. And then after the Civil War, it became the United States. And that's important because it moved from this idea that America is a federation of 50 independent countries to a single country.
And so, can you say more about what was sort of the global balance of power in the world at this time? Like, who was the most powerful country, and where was England relative to them?
Yeah, England was not an important country at this point. As a frame of reference, England had about 4 million people. France had 20 million people. Germany had 20 million people. Spain had 10 million people. England was a very wealthy country. It was a very technologically advanced country, but it wasn't a huge player on the European continent. And Spain was really the big empire of that time period. The Spanish had a really massive empire. And we forget this today because Spain's not a wealthy country anymore. Spain's completely irrelevant on the global stage. But the Spanish controlled all of Latin America. They controlled Italy. They controlled a lot of Germany, Austria, Central Europe, Belgium, the Philippines, places around the Indian Ocean. The Spanish had a colony on basically every single continent except Antarctica. And so the Spanish Empire was massive, but the Spanish Empire was also very poorly run. So across this whole time period, you'll see the Spanish Empire go into decline. And the Spanish had colonies in Florida. They had colonies in New Mexico, in Texas. And the English wanted to get into the Spanish Empire, and the French and the English formed their first colonies at the same time, where the French had colonies up in Canada. And with America was England's first colony, where after the American Revolution happened and they lost America, the English built this giant colonial empire in Africa, in Canada, in India, Australia, etc. But America was their first colony. And so the colonization of America was really the training wheels for the British Empire in the future.
Colonization of America was the training wheels for the British Empire in the future.
Yeah.
And so, at what point did England start to lose more power or start to get really weak, or like how did that develop?
You mean England or Spain?
Sorry, Spain. Yep.
Yeah. Spain is just a poorly run society. Like the Spanish just issued massive amounts of inflation. They were constantly bankrupting themselves. I wish our government today would pay attention to Spain in the 17th century, because it's a sign of how bad financial policy can destroy a society. The Spanish also had there's lots of poorly managed big government in history that we don't really pay attention to, where the Spanish had big government in economics, where they didn't have a free market. The government gave monopolies to buddies. And so let's say salt manufacturing or shoe manufacturing, a monopoly on that would be given to a buddy of the king's. And so Spain was just very poorly run, and they strangled the development of their own merchant classes and of their cities. And so Spain was actively de-developing over the 17th century. Spain had a population 1/3 lower at the end of the 17th century than the start of it. And so by the time we get to the year 1700 with the War of Spanish Succession, all of the other European empires were trying to divide up the Spanish Empire, because over the course of the 17th century, Spain had you could tell that it was a rotting corpse.
Totally. And so going back to colonial America, what were the other sort of big transition points in the sort of years leading up to the revolution?
Yeah. So we've talked at the foundation of New England and Virginia, and there's 6 big regions in colonial America, and these cultures still exist today. One of them is the Deep South, which is an extension of Virginia's culture in the South Carolina, Georgia, and and the Carolinas and Georgia, and then later in the Republic period spread out to Mississippi and Louisiana and that sort of thing. And this is a culture that was based off sugar and rice and indigo and later cotton, and it's 80% black, where the it was overwhelmingly black with a small, aggressive white elite that would police the blacks. And the black population in that part of the country is mostly from the Congo, where the beat line for rock and roll is from the Congo, and a lot of American culture is. And so that culture became very aggressive as this small white elite culture tried to tamper down and control a large black population. So if you look at the most aggressive parts of the country, or the parts of the country that push the most for foreign policy aggressiveness, it's the Deep South. And the South has performed the worst across human development statistics for all of American history. But the South has also created most of America's culture, whether barbecue, country, jazz, rock and roll. And the part of America that's developing the best today is the South, where the South and New England create this critical tension of newness and conservatism. And so for the other culture that developed in America, one is New York City, where New York City was a colony by the Dutch. And the point that I haven't teased out is that the Dutch and the Swedish had colonies in America. The Swedish very briefly in Delaware and Pennsylvania, and then it was conquered after the Dutch really quickly. But the Swedish colony, it had a lot of Finnish people. And so the Finns introduced the log cabin to America and skiing as well. And then the Dutch colony was really poorly managed. And the Dutch, in every single colony the Dutch have had around the world, whether South Africa, Indonesia, or New York, it was very extractive, where the Netherlands was a country run by a small monopoly of merchants. And so with the Netherlands, their ideal was, with New York City, their ideal was we want to make as much money as possible through fur trading. And so they developed this system where there wasn't really an incentive for Dutch people to immigrate to America because you would just be working on some wealthy landlord's land. So New York City was actually not that highly populated in the colonial period, where New York City was not the biggest city in America. Philadelphia was followed by Boston, and New York State was actually mostly forest in the colonial period. And New York City was so lightly populated that it got conquered by the English after the Dutch running it for 40 years. And so New York City in the colonial period had a pretty similar culture to today. New York City is constantly having it's the place in America that has the most immigrants. And so it was very multicultural in the colonial period with French and Black and Dutch and British people. Then over the 20th century, over the 19th century, you had Irish and Italian and Polish immigrants, and now you have immigrants from Africa or India or Puerto Rico or stuff. So New York's constantly having demographic renewal. But if you were to read what someone would say about New York City in the colonial period, they'd say the same things as today. They'd say the New Yorkers are corrupt. They'd say they're constantly caring about money. They'd say that they're very hustling. They're very intrepid. They're very intelligent. They're materialistic. So New York has kept its culture. And I have two more regional cultures I want to talk about in America, but I'll pause now so that I can grab some breath.
It's fascinating that many hundreds of years later, the culture still remains in New York, at least. What are the other regional cultures you want to describe?
The next one is Pennsylvania, and I'm from Pennsylvania, and this is my ancestors too. Where my mom's side of the family is from Nebraska, but it was people who lived in Pennsylvania in the colonial period, and this was a migration. So English Civil War summary. You guys don't have to remember this. Puritans get repressed by the monarchy. The Puritans beat the monarchy. They repress the supporters of the monarchy. England becomes a military dictatorship. Then military dictatorship fails. There was a sect in northern England called the Quakers, and I grew up as a Quaker. And the way Quakerism works is that everyone is equal before God, and you shouldn't have ceremony. So the Quakers sit in the room and meditate for an hour. And I did this twice a week for most of my life. And Quakers were seen as super dangerous, even though they're pacifist. And Quakers are seen today as like one of the cuddliest and least dangerous sects of Protestantism, because the Quakers were they didn't believe in the system of nobility that dominated Europe at the time. They thought that titles of nobility or swearing oaths in the Bible were bad. So it appeared to the society as if they wanted complete social destabilization. And so the Quakers were persecuted, and William Penn was the son. William Penn was a Quaker, and he was the son of the former admiral for the British Navy. And because the King Charles II, who was one of the most chill leaders in British history, he was actually brilliant, but he pretended to party all the time to offset all the strategic decisions he was making on the side. He gave William Penn, to pay off his family's debts, Pennsylvania, an area the size of England. And so William Penn set up a migration of Quakers to go to Pennsylvania. And this established the culture of Middle America and a lot of the Midwest. And so the Quakers were concentrated in the north and the middle of England. And my ancestors were part of this migration out to Pennsylvania. And they established Pennsylvania as an anarcho-capitalist state. So they abolished slavery. They gave total voting rights to all men. And it was a very capitalist society. And it also encouraged immigration, where the middle states, Pennsylvania and New York, were those which encouraged multiculturalism. And so Pennsylvania saw a lot of immigration from Germany and other parts of the British Isles. And this is the start of the concept of the American melting pot. And Pennsylvania became one of the wealthiest places in the world, and the place where the Industrial Revolution started in America, them in New England. And a pattern you see in American history is the colonies founded by religious fanatics did the best, because they had a strong moral code which maintained their culture very well. The problem with this Pennsylvanian culture, and the reason why Philadelphia has gone into decline, is that it's very provincial. It's pretty agreeable, and it will always push social stability over innovation. So that's why New York City has always beat Philadelphia, even though during the colonial period, Philadelphia was the most important city, because the New Yorkers are always willing to take the next jump to innovate. And for the final culture in British North America is the Scots-Irish. And these are people who moved from Ireland to settle in the north. Sorry, people from Scotland to settle in the north of Ireland when the English were trying to conquer Ireland. When the English conquered Ireland, they evicted the native Irish from the top of the island, brought in Scottish settlers, but it was still an overpopulated society. And the thing to understand about the settlement of America is the biggest motivation was overpopulation inside Britain. And when the British first saw America before they settled it, they thought, this is all this open, fertile land. We need to bring the poor English over here to just deal with overpopulation. And so these tribes, the Scots-Irish, they grew up in very violent areas on the borderland between England and Scotland. And so they had a warrior culture which prioritized masculinity, aggression, and that sort of thing, but not a work ethic, not capitalism. And they moved to Appalachia. And so they came from a herding culture, which a herding, non-farming culture. And so the mountains of Appalachia, which aren't very fertile, that worked really well for them. And the Scots-Irish would say, if I can see my neighbor's smokestack, that means this area is too densely populated. And so this set up the areas of Appalachia, stretching from Pennsylvania down to Georgia, and then they moved west during the Republic period, all the way to Texas. This part of the country, like West Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, parts of Texas, it's very lightly populated, and it's one of the poorest places in America. And people like to think that like white Anglo Protestants are wealthy, and that's not really true. Where British Americans are poorer on average than other white Americans, but you'll find this part of the country, people who are white British Americans who are desperately poor. Go to Tennessee, Kentucky, that part of the country. And every single thing, whether fatherlessness, obesity, drug addiction, they're at high rates. But this culture does have a lot of positives where it kept America real, and they were the people who pushed the frontier forward. Where Scots-Irish culture prioritizes freedom, it prioritizes masculinity. So they created country music. They fought against the elitism that you saw in the Northeast. And I think that the Scots-Irish have created a useful countervening force inside American society, pushing for realness and masculinity against decadence. And so, to summarize, in America, you saw the creation of these 6 different cultures, that being Puritan New England, New York, Pennsylvania, the Appalachians, Virginia, and the Deep South. And America was formed as a coalition between these different regional cultures. So when America was created, the idea is we're going to make an alliance of the states and a federal government which gives the states power and has a powerful enough centralized government to hold the society together. And I know it took forever to explain these regional cultures, but I think it's important to see them because this is still how America works today. You can still see these cultures if you go to Pennsylvania or Virginia or New Hampshire. And on any single metric you'd look at, whether religion, genetics, architecture, accent, food, political affiliation, these regional cultures still exist and they formed America.
Fascinating. Is there anything we haven't yet covered that you think we should, or anything underappreciated or misunderstood, or say more?
Yes. So you saw the creation of these different cultures, and at the same time, though, there was still the macro political picture. So we've been talking a lot about the regional parts of America, but let's talk about the broader themes going on. And one of which is that there was so much open land in America that it was a much freer society than anywhere else in the world. Where in Europe, things were overpopulated, and so the value of human life wasn't that important because human life was replaceable. And people worked as peasants, and there's a tremendous amount of poverty. But in America, there was too much open land and not enough people. And so you guys should watch my video on American civilization, but I go into more depth about this, where if you see the American character, libertarianism, a idea of thinking working people have value, where in Europe, if you were working, that meant you were poor, and that meant you were lame. And American optimism and utopianism and big sky thinking. America developed a lot of its character from just having so many resources with the frontier, or why we're a multicultural society, because there's enough to go around in America. If someone moved to your area from Germany, you weren't thinking these Germans are going to steal so my kids can't survive. You think, okay, there's enough forest for everyone. But this also does create the delusionality of America, where Americans can be delusional vis-a-vis other cultures. And the biggest external threat to the American colonies were the French, where the French had their own colonies in Canada and Louisiana. And the French had a giant colonial empire that stretched from Pittsburgh to the Rockies and from Louisiana to Canada. And so in the middle of the 18th century, the French Empire was much larger than the British 13 colonies. But the 13 colonies in the middle of the 18th century had 5 million people, and all of the French colonies had 80,000 people. So the French had this giant empire that was very lightly populated. And they did so by allying with the natives, where the British's main goal was to populate the area, and the French's was to do beaver trading with the natives, because the Europeans made much, much more money off the beaver trade and the fur trade than actually settling these areas. And so the British actually didn't want the Americans to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains because they didn't want to get rid of the money for fur trading. Because for the European governments, it was more important to trade furs than to actually populate these areas. And so the French and the British got into a war over over Pittsburgh, where George Washington was part of the British detachment to go out to Pittsburgh to deal with the French building their fort there. And so the 7 Years' War, which you could call the First World War, because there was fighting for the 7 Years' War in Europe, in America, and in India, off the coast of Africa too. And then through that, the British conquered all of the French colonies, except those west of the Mississippi, which Spain got. And once you remove the French as an external threat, you suddenly start to get the American Revolution, because when the French are no longer a threat, it means that the Americans don't need the British to protect them. And also, the revolution started when the British tried to get the Americans to pay taxes for the war where they beat the French. And then the Americans have said, we're not going to pay taxes because we don't have representation in British Parliament. And so once you remove the French threat, suddenly the colonial period stopped making sense.
Is this a good note to wrap on, or is there anything else you want to make sure leave our listeners with, whether it's reading recommendations or
yes.
Another synopsis of
sorts?
One
final point that I'll give the reading recommendations. That point is that America's democracy was founded during the colonial period, and the British were very hands-off with their empire. And so all of these states were self-governing, where these states had their local legislatures, and every single one of the 13 colonies were democracies. There were differing voter registrations between Virginia, where only 40% of the population could vote, or Pennsylvania and New England, where 100% of white men could vote. And so before the revolution, you had these pseudo-independent states. And what happened when the revolution started was the British wanted to exert more control over the 13 colonies. And so the revolution, it's not useful to see it as a revolution. It's useful to see it as these local governments weren't happy that the British were trying to encroach on their power. And the reason democracy worked in America was that we had a 200-year precedent of having democracy beforehand. And if you compare the American to the French Revolution, what was going on at the American Revolution, and when we do an episode in the French Revolution, we'll get to this, or on both, we'll get to this, is that the reason the American Revolution worked and American democracy has been so stable is that we were building on a pre-established precedent. Well, for France, they thought, we're going to kill the king and then just build a utopia. And so because it didn't come with that precedent and that training for democracy, that's why the French Revolution was so short-lived. And also, they got way too idealistic. But for my top 3 books in this topic, one would be Albion Seat by David Hackett Fisher. That goes through all the different regional cultures in America in this time period and the migrations from the UK. His book African Founders is the same thing, but for Black Americans. The Barbarous Years by Bernard Bailyn is also really good, and that's an account of the settlement of America in the first place, and how difficult it was to pull off. And Alan Taylor's American Colonies is also, that's the third book that I'd recommend, where that's a history of all the settlement of the New World during that time period. And you guys won't be able to buy this, but this great book is one of the best I've read. And I've destroyed the market for this book because it was written in the 40s, and so people have bought up all the copies now that I've recommended it. But Leland DeWitt Baldwin's The Story of the Americas is the best rendition of the colonization of the Americas that I've seen anywhere. So those are the 4 books I'd recommend.
What I learned from this episode is, we typically see America, or people see America, as like a creedal nation, i.e., a nation based on beliefs, as opposed to a nation of individual peoples. And I think this episode, understanding things like Albion Seed, gives greater appreciation for the sort of different peoples that have emerged over a period of time and how that's led to conflict or sort of, sorting up based on those lines.
That's a good point, because America's national mythology is that we are the Constitution. Well, the reality is we're a people like any other. We're an organic society that developed in it by itself. And Americans, we don't tend to think of other people's culture because we're so isolated. But once you understand how different Chinese or French or Muslim culture is from America, you suddenly start to think about, wait, how did America evolve its culture in the first place?
Yeah, awesome. Well, we'll do more episodes in America in the future.
Sounds good.
The Revolution, Civil War,
Yeah,
etc. But for now, let's wrap. Ready? Another great episode. Until next time.
of course. Thank you. Sounds good.